In the quiet hours before dawn, when cities still sleep and markets have not yet opened, the world often appears solid, ordered, enduring. Streets are empty yet familiar. Institutions stand where they have always stood. Currencies circulate. Laws are cited. Leaders speak of continuity. This is the surface of history, the polished face that societies present to themselves. Yet beneath that surface, across centuries and continents, the same pattern has repeated. The conviction that the present order is permanent, that the systems holding daily life together cannot fail because they have not failed yet. The illusion of stability is not a minor error of perception. It is one of the most consistent and costly features of human civilization. It has preceded the fall of empires, the unraveling of economies, the quiet death of social contracts. And it begins, almost always, in silence. Consider the rhythm of ordinary existence in the years before rupture. In Rome of the late 2nd century, bakers still rose before light to fire their ovens. In the Maya lowlands, farmers cleared fields with the same stone tools their grandparents had used. In the Soviet Union of the early 1980s, factory workers clocked in under portraits of leaders whose authority seemed as fixed as the concrete of the apartment blocks. Daily life does not announce its own fragility. People buy bread, argue over taxes, arrange marriages, complain about the weather. The machinery of routine continues to turn, and that very continuity becomes evidence, in the minds of those living it, that the foundations remain sound. The illusion is not born of stupidity. It is born of habit, of the human need to treat the familiar as permanent. Yet the first fractures rarely announce themselves with drama. They appear as small irregularities, almost technical. A harvest that falls short by a few percent. A coinage that begins to contain less precious metal. A statistical report that no longer matches the lived experience of shortages. In the French countryside of the 1780s, the price of grain climbed in increments that felt manageable until they were not. In the financial centers of 2007, complex instruments continued to trade at values that assumed endless liquidity. The people closest to these systems often noticed the anomalies first, but their warnings were absorbed into the larger narrative of resilience. After all, the system had absorbed shocks before. The past became a shield against the future. What had not collapsed could not, by definition, be collapsing. As the pressure accumulated, language itself began to change. Official statements grew longer and more reassuring. Statistics were refined, redefined, delayed. In the late Roman Empire, chroniclers recorded victories that no longer matched the maps. In the final decades of the Qing dynasty, edicts spoke of harmony while famine and rebellion spread along the rivers. The gap between the described world and the experienced world widened slowly, then suddenly. Citizens learned to read between the lines, to interpret silence as information. Markets that once reflected confidence began to price in uncertainty. Trust, that invisible currency more valuable than gold, started to erode in private conversations long before it vanished from public squares. The decisions that accelerated the process were rarely made in a single dramatic hour. They were incremental, each one rational within its narrow frame. A government deferred reform because the political cost seemed higher than the risk of delay. An elite class protected its privileges by extracting more from a shrinking base. Military spending continued even as the tax system that funded it hollowed out. In the years before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, successive administrations chose short-term stability over structural change. In the Soviet Union, the refusal to confront economic stagnation was justified as the preservation of social peace. Each choice appeared, at the time, as prudence. Together, they formed a pattern of deferred reckoning. Then came the moment when the system's capacity to absorb stress was exceeded. It did not always look like chaos at first. Sometimes it looked like acceleration. Prices rose faster. Lines lengthened. Rumors traveled more quickly than official denials. In the financial crisis of 2008, the failure of a single institution revealed how thoroughly risk had been distributed and disguised. In the French Revolution, a fiscal crisis that had been managed for years suddenly became unmanageable when credit evaporated. The machinery that had once converted uncertainty into routine now converted routine into uncertainty. People who had planned their lives around the assumption of continuity found those plans dissolving in real time. Social bonds, which had seemed robust, began to fray under the weight of competing survival strategies. Neighbors who had shared festivals now competed for scarce resources. Institutions that had mediated conflict lost legitimacy and, with it, the ability to enforce order without force. In the final phases of many collapses, the state itself became one more competitor rather than a neutral arbiter. The Maya cities emptied not in a single catastrophe, but through a cascade of decisions by families who calculated that remaining was no longer viable. The same quiet arithmetic played out in other times and places. When the cost of staying exceeded the cost of leaving, departure became rational, and the collective illusion of permanence shattered into individual calculations. The human consequences unfolded in layers. First came the material. Empty shelves, abandoned workshops, fields left fallow because the incentives that once sustained them had inverted. Then came the psychological. Certainty about the future, once taken for granted, became a luxury. Parents could no longer promise their children the same world. Status hierarchies that had structured ambition lost their meaning when the markers of status themselves lost value. In the streets of collapsing cities, the soundscape changed. The ordinary noise of commerce gave way to quieter, more watchful rhythms. Fear did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered in the careful way people counted what remained. Yet even as the old order disintegrated, new patterns of adaptation emerged. Informal networks replaced formal ones. Barter supplemented currency. Local authorities filled voids left by distant ones. These adaptations were not always progressive. They could be brutal, exclusionary, short-sighted. But they demonstrated a fundamental truth. Human societies do not simply end. They transform under pressure, often into forms that the previous generation would not have recognized as continuity. The illusion of stability had hidden not only the fragility of the old system, but also the latent capacity for reorganization, however painful. Looking across the long arc of these episodes, a recurring structure becomes visible. Stability is rarely an equilibrium. It is more often a temporary balance of forces that can shift when one variable, climate, debt, legitimacy, technology, moves beyond a threshold. The societies that lasted longest were not those that denied change, but those that periodically renegotiated the terms of their own order. Those that treated stability as an inheritance rather than a daily achievement were the ones most vulnerable to the quiet accumulation of stress. The pattern is not destiny, but it is persistent enough to demand attention. The most unsettling feature of the illusion is how thoroughly it can coexist with information. In almost every documented case, data existed that, in retrospect, pointed towards systemic strain. The problem was not the absence of signals, but the interpretive frameworks that filtered them. Prosperity was measured in ways that excluded externalities. Resilience was assumed rather than tested. Leadership selected for continuity of message rather than accuracy of diagnosis. By the time the framework itself cracked, the window for orderly adjustment had often closed. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began with the confident assertion that chaos was impossible. In the end, the historical record offers no comfort of uniqueness. Every generation that has lived through rupture has believed, until the evidence became undeniable, that its own circumstances were different. The tools of the present, data, models, global coordination, create a new form of the same illusion: the belief that complexity equals control. Yet complexity can also amplify cascade effects. The systems that support modern life are denser, faster, and more interdependent than those of any previous era. That density is a source of extraordinary capability. It is also a source of shared vulnerability. The past does not dictate the future, but it does illustrate the cost of mistaking temporary balance for permanent design. What remains, after the accounts of fallen cities and emptied treasuries, is a quieter recognition. The sensation of stability is real while it lasts. The bread is baked. The trains run. The laws are cited. And yet the same sensation has preceded every major discontinuity in the human story. To study those discontinuities is not to predict the next one with precision. It is to remember that the ground beneath ordinary life has never been as solid as it felt in the years before it moved. The illusion does not vanish because it is exposed. It returns, generation after generation, because the alternative living in permanent readiness for rupture is a burden most societies are unwilling to carry until they have no choice.